Hi, my name is John Novikoff. I'm a retired clergyman, but I've come into Christ Church as a layman back in 1987. And I've been here with my wife since. I guess the story I'd like to share at this particular time is a story about our involvement with generosity. It began back in 52, when my son was born. At that particular time, I did not have a strong leaning towards the church. But at that particular time, when my son was born, I felt a particular sensation of God's Spirit in my life that all I could do is go to my pastor and talk to him and tell him how grateful I was that I had become a father. Of course, later I had 2 other sons, and certainly was grateful about them. We began to go to the church there in North Hollywood, California, called the Little Brown Church of the Valley. It was in North Hollywood on Coldwater Canyon Avenue, right off of Riverside. Very small church. It was a church that the pastor had built using many of the lay people. It was made out of knotty pine and very small chapel-like church. We began to attend there, and after a while, the pastor came to our house after our first son was born, and he had asked us if we would not be interested in working at the church. Margot, my wife, was hired as the receptionist because we had a lot of weddings going on there. And I was hired as the janitor. But the pastor made it very clear. He said, "You are not a receptionist and you're not a janitor, you are the associate ministers." Well, we love that too. But you know, for me, being a dropout out of high school and just barely getting my GED, I did not feel like I was a minister at all. But later on, there were some things that happened. The preacher, John Wells, preached many times on giving. And when he preached on giving, he really talked about the tithe. So that meant 10% of all of our earnings. Now, back there in the early 50s, when we were working for a Lockheed Aircraft, and I was working as a mechanic, if we were to earn something like about $400 to $500 a month, that was pretty good money for us. We got to talking about this, and Margot, who always had a concern for the poor as well as for those who needed money, though we had very little, said, "Why don't we go ahead and begin tithing?" Now, it took a while for me to really get it through my head because I needed to hold on to what I had, I thought. Well, as faith had it, I had pretty well accepted Jesus Christ into my life there at the Little Brown Church and was baptized in 1956. And what happened after that was that we did give in and we began to tithe. So we gave 10% of whatever we had, and though we had the opportunity to live in a parsonage, which was less income to spend for us, still we felt like we lived comfortably. Now, one day, one of our friends who had 5 children was living out in what they call the Canoga Park area, and Frank and his wife basically were just 2 very ardent Christians, and we loved them very much, had 5 children. And one day, Margot said to me, "Have you heard that Frank lost his job? And in addition to that, where he lives right now, he's about ready to be evicted." And I said, well, okay, what can we do? And said, do we have any money at all? Well, our bank savings were zero at that time. But I was working as a mechanic at a Ford agency. And it was also the period of time where I was working on commission. So every job I did was a commission type labor. And it was the first week that I was looking forward to receiving $100 clear in my paycheck. Now, it sounds like a lot of money today, or not enough money, but then it was big. Well, anyway, Margot kept saying, we got to help Frank and his wife and family. So I said, well, let me think about it, let me pray about it. Well, it came Sunday. They were in church with us in the morning, and we did have evening services as well. So I was praying about this through the day, and finally it kind of hit me, well, you know, this is really God's money, not mine, because I really believe that God made us stewards of whatever we had, but I did want to hold on to some of it. Anyway, turns out that I submitted to Margot, or rather Margot persuaded me to go ahead and help out. So I got my check earlier that Friday and cashed it. And then we went out to Canoga Park that evening after our last church service. We stopped at Frank's house, called him out. He said, wow, why are you all here? And all we could say at the time is our regret that he was being evicted, but we have come to give him a gift. So I gave him the $100. Margot and I both gave it to him. And of course, he was just elated, and that felt good. And then we just sort of, we had our prayers, we turned around and left. Well, what happened in about 2 days later was something I was not expecting. And there was in the mail a check for me for $103 that came from the IRS. And I was very happy to receive that, but it was also a sign that God will take care of you when you take care of his work. So for the most part, that's kind of what we had done, is we took the position that this was God's money, and that we were stewards of his, that we were managing any kind of an account that we could. Well, that's basically the way it went, and we felt very keenly about anything we were giving to the church. Margot was very concerned about the poor. She always had that concern, and those of you who knew her, she did not mind at all sharing her concern if that was appropriate. And so every time we found that something was out of line financially, we would try to step up to the plate and help out. One of the things that I think I do need to say is that it's like so many other things, that if one gets a little bit weak in their prayers and in their discipline, it doesn't take long for the devil to sneak in. And for me, after a period of years, I began to sense that I needed to kind of hold on to some of the monies that we had. And as I held on, there were other things that crept in. And so without stating too much about it, I began to have some serious problems mentally, physically. A lot of it had to do with drinking. And when that happened, I found myself to become very undisciplined. And at this particular point, I was also a pastor of a church. In fact, I became a chaplain in the United States Army. And so I began to lose my disciplines that I should have had, that were basic disciplines. I thought that reading out of a prayer book would be great, but while the prayer is very touching and can move, yet it was not the same kind of prayer that came from my heart. And so I found myself slipping into an area that I did not need to be in. And later I found that basically I had to even leave my church where I was a pastor. But as it was at that time, I did go into treatment work. I became a counselor and later a director for what is known as the Chatham Clinic right here in Savannah. Of course, it's not by that name anymore. And as I became its director, that even was something that I did not expect. But all the way through this, I found that our giving had to stay up there. And so both Margot and I, we decided that what we needed to do is to go ahead and make sure that whatever monies that we had, we needed to commit that to the Lord. One of the things about generosity is that it extends beyond money. In, I forget the date, but it had to be at least 25 years ago, we had a couple that came in from New York City, a very young couple, and they were living in, really in squalor practically. And we had a friend that called us and said, look, you have a house and you have an extra room, and one of your sons has vacated the room. Why don't you let them have a place to stay? And we did. We allowed them to stay. It was a very young couple. Unfortunately, the husband had some kind of a criminal record, and later he was arrested. Later on, we had another couple that came from up in Massachusetts. And they were an elderly couple, right around the 60s, not like me, but still they came, and very lovely couple. And it turned out that apparently the husband had a heart problem when they were visiting here in Savannah. They were just coming through. And it ended up where he ended up in a hospital, and in his convalescence, he needed more time to come around to good health. So it turned out that we were again asked to take in another couple, and so we did. And we had them in our house for at least 3 months or so. And finally, there was another, and I think that we had good parishioners here that were involved in this after I initiated it. And one was that I sponsored a young man from Russia, from Siberia, to come and live with us for a while. And after he lived with us for a little while, which was about 2 or 3 months, then we had several of the parishioners right here at Christ Church that invited him. One invited him to live with them over in, let's see, I can't remember exactly, but it was the Winters family who were with us at the time. And then I think that Dave Solana also helped out with transportation to take him to school. And we had the Savage family actually sponsor tuition for this man. He's young Pavel Solomon. And Solomon had a bad problem where he needed medical help. I won't describe what kind of a problem he had, but it was one where veins were on the top of his legs, and that a lot of the bone marrow was affected. But yet he had a good spirit about him. Well, he went back later to Siberia, studied. He wanted to be a doctor. Unfortunately, there was not a major in medical science at that time. So he took on finances, which was the only thing they had in the far east of Russia. But today, he is in Moscow. He is married. He's got 2 children, and he's head of a bank right there in Moscow. And I say all this because it's the generosity of many of us that extend to somebody that gives them the freedom to be what they want to become. So I'm not sure how much more I need to talk about. Better take a look at my notes just a minute. But I do want to mention Philippians, because Philippians is a very strong epistle to all of us. And I need to put on my glasses. In Philippians 3, beginning with chapter 7, the Apostle Paul says, "But whatever things were gained to me, these things I have counted as loss for the sake of Christ. More than that, I count all things to be loss in view of the surpassing value of knowing Jesus Christ my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things and count them but rubbish, so that I may gain Christ, and may be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own derived from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness which comes from God on the basis of faith, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death." Margot, my wife of 66 years, who died actually 2 years ago, she believed in that particular verse of Scripture very ardently. And that's what we both felt. There was a time when I fell off a little bit, and I think even she had a problem for a little while. But in falling off, we also learned that in the Psalms, we do have a great message. And that message is basically that although we have been afflicted, we can return to the Lord, because that's what he wants us to do. And so with that, we both found ourselves, until she died, still very grateful to our God for what he had done for us through Jesus Christ.